Well, Disventure Camp Season 4, Carnival Chaos is finally over, after a long year, and despite its ups and downs, it is hands down the best season of the series so far, and it is largely thanks to its stellar cast of contestants, and so I've decided to rank them all from my least favorite to most beloved. But before we begin, there are a few disclaimers I need to address. Firstly, this ranking is based solely on my personal opinion, and believe me, I have plenty of unpopular ones. And finally, I don't actually outright dislike anyone in this cast, which speaks to the quality of it. Anyway, with that said, let's go over this list, shall we? At number 18 and the very bottom is Diego. Unfortunately, Diego finds himself at the bottom of my list, but like I said, I don't hate the guy. The main reason for him being in this spot is his weird approach to courting Spencer. And after 2 seasons of Tom Jake, I was dreading another annoying and melodramatic romance storyline. However, surprisingly, the writers don't force Diego and Spencer into a relationship. A case of subverting expectations done right, which saved Diego's character from suffering more than it already was. At number 17 is Amelie, and already we have the first of my unpopular opinions. The first nitpick I have with Amelie is that I feel that her arc of learning to be less callous needed a bit more time to develop. This becomes especially egregious when she still acts bitchy the majority of the time since her first elimination. And after she returns to the game, the show attempts to showcase a parallel between her and Hannah, and how they supposedly switched roles. But to be honest, it feels like the writing is just telling the audience this, rather than showing it. And this plot point gets contradicted in episode 20, where rather than exposing Logan's lie and saving Sade from getting framed, Amelie stays silent, and allows him to get unfairly eliminated and labeled as a traitor, just so she can blackmail Logan for his vote, choosing helping her own game over doing what's right. Which, if you ask me, is far more callous than literally anything that Hannah did during the merge. This also makes Amelie a hypocrite for criticizing her in the previous episode. And those are the reasons why I personally don't enjoy Amelie as a character, as much as the rest of the Disventure Camp fandom. And at number 16 is Marissa. Marissa is by far one of the least interesting members of this cast, as she blatantly gets relegated to solely being Anastasia's girlfriend, as her own story of choosing not to recruit in the military like the rest of her family goes underexplored. In retrospect, she didn't need to re-enter the game, given that she doesn't get developed much further. And she and Anastasia could have had their confessional blub and kiss the first time she was eliminated. Also, there are 2 separate occasions where a conflict was set up for her, only for it to get immediately dropped. Like when she was mad at Linda for making the Girls Alliance switch their boats at the last minute, and then decides she needs to get her eliminated, only to suddenly want to make peace with her, even after she flipped on their alliance. And then there was the time she got mad at Anastasia for hurting Ivy's shoulder, which seemed like an obvious setup for conflict in their relationship, only for the incident to be completely forgotten about. Marissa's placement on this list is not so much because I dislike her, but due to being failed by the writing team at oddnationcartoons. At number 15 is Richard. Richard is a nice old man, and that's just about it. Don't get me wrong, he is pretty likable, but he's very much a standard supporting character. Plus, a lot of his lines are written in a generic way. He also gets mad at Logan and Natalia for flipping on him, but then is quickly okay with it when they do it a second time. I don't know, I got nothing else to say about Richard. While he is genuinely likable, it's hard to place him higher than 15 on my list. At number 14 is Sade, and here we have another nice guy, but with far more range to his personality. Unfortunately, however, he blatantly gets relegated to being a plot device for the stories of his fellow contestants during the merge, and his friendship with Anastasia is woefully underdeveloped, given how important it was narratively. If you ask me, Marissa shouldn't have returned. That way, more time could be put into making this relationship feel genuine. Although, his romance with Ivy is pretty cute. At number 13 is Jade. Yeah, I'll admit that I'm not the biggest Jade fan out there, as I tend to gravitate more towards characters with flashy personalities. Also, her moral grandstanding really bugs me, like how she criticized Isabel's plan to pit Anastasia and Marissa against each other as immoral, even though she herself refused to help Logan when he was drowning, and took advantage of the situation in order to win immunity. Yeah, you're in no position to preach, you self-righteous hypocrite. Overall, while she isn't the most enjoyable character to me personally, she still has her merits, and the conclusion to her arc alongside the bond she made was fairly satisfying. And at number 12 is Natalia. I'll admit, much like Spencer, I'm not the biggest fan of the way she talks half of the time, but there are still a couple of bangers here and there. One thing about her character that does appeal to me is her big heart, and her friendships with her fellow contestants such as Isabel, Logan, and Richard were endearing. However, the writing for her character arc is pretty wonky, as back when she betrayed Logan and Richard at Marissa's blind side, showing her regretting what she did to them, as she tries to make amends with them, which leads to some personal growth for her, only for all of that to get thrown out the window, when she ditches them yet again for the Girls Alliance. And for number 11 is Linda. Linda is a perfect example of a love-to-hate character, constantly berating and criticizing everyone around her, and playing the victim, all while being completely oblivious to the fact that she is the one who is in the wrong. I also think it's interesting how she never really sees the error of her ways, and grows from the experience. Instead, she leaves the game as big of a prick as she was at the beginning. At number 10 is Anastasia. Anastasia was probably the hardest character to rank on this list, and it's difficult to articulate my thoughts on her. This is mainly due to the fact that her character is full of highs and lows. You can admire the fierce competitor that she is, but other times, she just comes across as an aggressive a-hole. I like how her friendships with Logan and Sade showed her that not every man is her enemy, as at the beginning of the season, she came across as the toxic type of feminist, who generalizes all men in a negative light. However, that potential growth often gets stunted and contradicted on several occasions. But I also like seeing her softer side when she interacts with Marissa. Overall, I do lean more positively towards her character, despite the writing issues. And for the number 9 spot is Ivy. Ivy is an interesting character, as she has two personality traits that seem contradictory on paper, and yet end up blending together perfectly, making her one of the most entertaining contestants to watch. On the one hand, she's a narcissist who needs to be the center of attention and constant praise, and won't settle for being considered anything but the absolute best. However, this negative trait is balanced out with her genuinely endearing positivity. I also love the clever ways the two sides of her intersect, in moments where she intends to be nice, but is oblivious to the fact that she's actually being passive-aggressive and even downright mean at times. But she does learn from these faults, as demonstrated when she apologizes to Benji for bullying him. At number 8 is Spencer. To be honest, I wasn't a big fan of Spencer for much of the season, as he was simply a prick, but not in a fun way like Linda, nor were there redeemable traits to his personality like with Ivy, at least in my opinion. However, over time my view on Spencer shifted, as he gained character development during the latter half of his run. The growth he gains from his betrayal and eventual reconciliation with Diego, and friendship with Logan was admittedly fascinating to watch, and made him far more likable in my eyes. At number 7 is Hannah. Hannah is a fun personality and has one of the best stories of the season, starting off as an underdog who eventually becomes jaded after every friend she makes gets voted off. From there, her story transitions from surviving the game against all odds to becoming consumed by the darkness in her life before learning to have fun and smile again at the end. At number 6 is Isabel. Isabel is one of the best personalities of the cast, as I adore all of her funny little quirks and antics. I also appreciate that her story isn't as simple as religion, and people who follow it are evil, like with the majority of modern media, instead making it clear that she is just a flawed person. At number 5 is Alessio. Okay, how the F does the first boot of the season end up this high on the list? Simple, because Alessio is goated. At first we get a nice little character arc of him discovering what's suppressing his artistic inspiration that fits neatly within the 2 episodes he competes in, but his character also greatly benefits from the extra screen time he gets in the Rescue Island, Return Challenge, and Motel episodes. Alessio is entertaining, plain and simple, with his eccentric personality and hilarious line delivery. At number 4 is Tristan. Tristan is just so freaking wholesome, and that's honestly all I got to say about them. They got a big heart, and I adore how well they support the people around them. with each of their relationships feeling heartfelt and genuine. Especially their romance with Benji. I'm just gonna say it. Trenji is the best ship in all of Disventure Camp. At number 3 is Ted. Ted is the GOAT, plain and simple, and it is criminal how little screen time he got, as every line of his is pure gold. To be honest, I predicted that he would have a short run, but man, I wish I was wrong, because he had one of the best personalities of the season. He's not only very funny, but I also like the softer side of him, as shown in his exit interview. From the love for his wife and son, to having empathy for what Richard has to go through, due to having a close friend who's gay himself. And at number 2 is Logan. Okay, I am aware of how controversial of a take this is, but I can't help it. I freaking love Logan Bell. I'm a sucker for wholesome himbos, and Logan is no exception, as I enjoy every comedic moment and touching friendship his character brings. I'll admit, the writing for his character does get messy during the rate merge, but I can overlook these flaws due to my overall enjoyment of him. And finally, my number 1 favorite contestant of Disventure Camp Season 4 is Benji. The Benjinator is my favorite character of the season. No, scratch that. The entire Disventure Camp series, period. As not only is he the funniest and most wholesome character, but also the one who I relate to the most, as I am also a geek who has a non-existent social life, so it was truly inspiring to see him grow and become a breakout star. And that was my ranking of the Disventure Camp Carnival Chaos contestants. Hope all of you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all next time.